I love quilts. You do too, Luna? We should cut one up. So it is a hot trend right now to take an old quilt, or maybe even to create some new patchwork and then cut it up to make a quilt coat. And that's exactly what I plan to do. So stay tuned. Last weekend, I took a trip with my husband Jason up to northern Utah to Vintage Market Days. And we just went for fun to have a date and check things out. But I went looking for a couple of things specifically, which I did find. And one of them was a vintage quilt for cutting to make something fun. So let me show you the quilt that I found. It has a Star of Bethlehem center. And the colors on it are blues, grays, pinks, and some purple. And I think it's just really pretty. And it's in remarkably good condition, though I will say there are a couple of issues. There were a couple of holes that have been patched over with lace. And then there are quite a few different seams that had obviously come apart at some point, and somebody took the time to go and stitch them closed. I'm trying to find, because there's a lot of them, but now that I'm looking, I can't find it. A lot of seams that have been stitched closed. Let's see if we can get it to show. Along here. They're all over the place, and the stitching isn't delicate or dainty or hidden, which doesn't bother me at all. But the other issue is that it has very little quilting, and the quilting that it had was coming out, was coming apart. And when you stitch quilts with a little bit of quilting, that puts more stress on the threads that are there, and they tend to break easier, and then your quilt comes apart faster. So for instance, in this center block, block, medallion, Star of Bethlehem, what am I trying to call that? Anyways, the centerpiece of the quilt, this entire center had only, I think, 3 lines of stitching remaining in it. And that's huge. You typically need 2 to 3 inches apart of lines of stitching. And then these blocks right here had no quilting. These had no quilting. And then the same thing with the center of these, it had no quilting. So all it had was around the outside. And then this border has no quilting. And so it's a very, very pretty quilt, but very little quilting. So I have been working on adding in some quilting lines to it and repairing the ones that are already broken. So now you can start to see that there's more, and it'll help it last longer, and it just looks really nice. I am not going to fill this whole thing up though with as much quilting as I would like, because the purpose of me buying this quilt was to cut up. I say was, it is for me to cut it up and do different crafts with. That's what I went specifically looking for a quilt for. So I know that that breaks many people's heart, people who are quilters. I am a quilter. It somewhat breaks my heart, but it also doesn't. I think that repurposing something so that it will be used rather than falling apart or sitting forever in a bin or a closet or an armoire somewhere is better. So if it's going to get new life as something else and be used then and cherished, then that's great. Yes, I could keep this as a quilt, but I want one to cut up. So what I want to make with it is a quilt jacket. And I have been looking all over at tutorials and patterns, and I think I've decided what I'm going to make. But first I need to go finish adding in the quilting that I have planned to add into this. So I have already started on this by working on the quilt top. I have done some quilting on there, not as much as I would like, but it's sufficient. And now I have a pattern from fabricsstore.com called the payola jacket, and now I have to tape these all together, trim it out. That's the downside of buying a digital pattern, is that there's all that assembly work. So I'm just going to spend a while doing that. I'm following a tutorial that I watched on YouTube. I will link it below. She uses this pattern. I start by laying out my pattern piece, and then after I have traced around it, I flip it to the other side. This is the back panel, and it took me a long time to decide exactly where I wanted to place it. I wanted to really showcase this beautiful patchwork on the back of my quilt coat. Now, I had to think a while before I finally cut into this and think, do I really want to cut this? In the end, yes I did, you can see.
wanted to get the most out of this patchwork, so I'm leaving quite a bit of the border that does not have much quilting at all and not a lot of design interest. So now you can really see how this pattern is going to show up. Now for the front pieces. I take my back piece and I measure the border along the bottom so that I can mirror that along the front the best that I can. Old quilts, over years, they shift and things are never exactly square and straight, and so I can do my best to try to line things up, but it will never be exact, and that just has to be okay. And now I have finished cutting out the front and the back. And look at those sleeves. That's going to be beautiful.
Okay, I finally got not all of the pieces, but most of them cut out. I did not cut out pockets or the hood because I haven't decided on pockets, and the hood I will make after I've seamed everything together, and I will draft the pattern then. But I ended up not putting the center medallion of this quilt on the back center of my coat like I thought I would. So I decided not to for a couple of reasons. One, it is the only area on the quilt that has any purple, and it's just this ring of purple. So if I put that on the back, it wouldn't be anywhere else on the quilt or on the coat. So I didn't know that I would like that. Plus, I would have cut a main panel out of the very center of the quilt, making it difficult to use other parts. So then I was looking at maybe using only the top half of it, and I thought, no, I don't want points coming down my shoulder blades like this. So then I thought, okay, maybe it'd come down the center back and you'd have this along the shoulders. And then I thought, once again, it's going to make it difficult to use the rest of the quilt. So I decided not to use the center panel for the coat back. I might use it for the hood because this area does have a lot of pink and the rest of this doesn't have a lot. It has a lot more blue. So I could kind of bring the pink that's on the bottom here up towards the top. Plus the hood is going to be a big piece. Or I might make the hood from this. I'll have to decide when it's time there. And then that would leave this center medallion to do something really fun with in another project. But what do you think so far?
So now I need to decide on what fabric to use for the bias binding to finish all of my seams and the edges. I've pulled fabric from my stash, but I don't really like any of them. So I decided to take a trip to a new to me fabric store. This is called the Quilter's Lodge, and just the exterior is so inviting. I'm really excited to see what treasures it holds inside. Success! I have found two options that I think will work really well. I think the blue might be the best color-wise.
All right, I am back from the fabric store. I've got my 2 options, and I was taking pictures outside in the daylight, in the sunlight, and it looked like this would be a better option and this would not. But looking at it here, I actually like this better than this. This will blend right in, which is nice, but I really want to add more pink. Having that pop of pink all the way around, I think will be my preference. So I need to make some binding for that. It's day 2. I've been working on my quilt coat again, and I have sewn that shows you exactly what I've done. Let's try and fix it. Okay, I've sewn the shoulders together, and I've done the bias bias binding on it, which I'll show you that in a minute. I've sewn the sleeves on. Now, normally with set-in sleeves, you sew up the side seams, you make the sleeve into a tube, and then you put it in. I'm not doing it that way because of the bias tape binding. So I'm finishing all my raw edges with this because that will make it nice and clean, because you know the quilt edges are all fluffy and frayed and lots of layers, so that just helps encase all of it. So I need to do that on the sleeve now.
So here I'm going to show you how I cover a seam with bias binding. I trimmed down the seam so it's not as thick and bulky. Now I'm checking underneath every now and again to make sure that I'm not catching any fabric that has accidentally slipped up. And these scissors cut like a dream. Watch it go through this bulky seam right here. No problem. These are Guggenheim scissors. Now I'm going to add the bias binding underneath my seam so that I can stitch in the same seam line as before. I open up all the fabric there to make sure nothing gets pulled into the seam that shouldn't. And just take my time. I don't want to pull the bias binding so that it distorts the shape of it. Then after sewing, I pull it from the back to the other side, and I've folded it under twice and pinned it so that it covers my seam line, but just barely. This is a tedious, time-consuming process, especially because I've decided to sew it down by hand. I could sew it down by machine, but sometimes I just really enjoy the slow process of handwork. And it's so satisfying to get such a nice, neat edge. Here you can see I have finished adding bias binding around all of the edges, including the sleeves. I just have to turn them inside and stitch it down by hand. I even made some patch pockets and lined them with old vintage sheets. I was very careful to make sure these pockets lined up with the patchwork the best that I could so they would disappear.
Now, before you get too excited and I share the grand reveal, you might be wondering, what in the world are you going to do with all the leftover scraps? Well, the first thing I did is I made a gift for my daughter for Christmas that she has been really excited about. Check it out.
I bought a new sweatshirt hoodie from Cotton On, and I unpicked the hood and the front pocket, and I used that as a template to cut some patchwork out, which I attached to those pieces so that the lining was still the sweatshirt, and so it was very warm and very cozy. I saved the best part of the quilt to use on this, the center medallion that had the most patchwork, and so it really shines here on the pocket and on the hood.
But that still leaves me with a pile. And there are a lot of really great usable pieces in here. And so with some pretty patchwork, let's see, my favorite part right here. So I am thinking I'm going to make myself some bags, some notions, pouches, some little scrappy bits, maybe a little stuffed animal, like a little tiny teddy bear. I've got all sorts of scraps that I can use. I've got the border of the quilt still that could make the top of a tote bag that would be really cute. So there is a lot that I could still do with these pieces, and I plan to use up all the scraps. But enough of that. Let's see how the quilt coat turned out.